When I was a kid, my dad traveled a lot for work. Back then, his company was growing exponentially, and my father was sent to oversee the opening of new stores all across the country. In 2002, he had a particularly busy year. My dad was assigned to a store in Pennsylvania, and because it was a longer assignment and because it was summertime as well, he decided to take my mom and I with him. Since we were going to be there for 2 months, they gave us a fully furnished house in the suburbs. It was 2 stories tall and at the end of a very lonely cul-de-sac. The town itself was very small, with a little over 3,000 residents, and the suburb where we stayed was even more rural. Our neighborhood was relatively new, and most of the houses were still empty. The housing development, Lonewood, had only just started cutting into the dense forest that surrounded it, and all the empty houses gave it a very eerie, albeit boring feel. Lucky for me, there were a few other kids who lived in Lonewood, and one of them happened to be my age. Jamie and I were both 12, and really that was all we needed to have in common. We had a lot of fun that summer. Being a city kid, I was eager to explore all the bike trails local kids had made out in the woods. The city of Middlesbrough was a very old town which was incorporated sometime in the early 1800s. The town had tons of history, but nothing really to do. One particularly boring Sunday, Jamie and I even went to the town's museum. It was pretty boring, as expected, until we heard some kid ask an employee about the lost town. The employee replied that that was just a legend, but that was enough to pique my curiosity. I quizzed Jamie about it, but he didn't seem to know much either. It was a full 5 weeks into the summer before I finally got my questions answered. Jamie and I were building a bike ramp over a narrow stream late one afternoon when we saw a group of 5 teenagers boisterously heading out into the woods. They were carrying flashlights and beer, several of them trying to scare the girls of the group into turning back. I wonder where they're going. I mused as I glanced over at Jamie. He stood up and wiped his brow. I know where they're going. Where? I stood up and dusted the dirt off my shorts. The novelty of living in a small town had weeks ago given way to boredom, and I jumped on anything that sounded remotely interesting. They're looking for the lost town. He sighed regretfully. Okay, seriously, what is that? I knew you know more than you let on. I need to know, Jamie. I need to know. I shook his shoulders in mock hysteria, and he stumbled for balance. All right, I'll tell you. Geez, Katie. Jamie picked up his bike and started walking down the bike path. I grabbed mine and followed him. The lost town is just a dumb legend. The stories say that Middlesbrough had a sister city nearby, somewhere out in these woods. Then one day, like a century and a half ago, the whole town just disappeared. The people left or died. Nobody knows. Nobody even remembers the name of the town. It's like a rite of passage or something for kids to go looking for it. Jamie, we should... No! He stopped and turned to look at me. Some kid went looking for it in the 70s and never came back. They found his body like 10 years later in the middle of nowhere. He got lost out there. It's easy to do. Everything looks the same. He was a total idiot. Probably on drugs. It was 70s. We are a totally different generation. We have sat-nav. Sat-nav? He looked at me curiously. Jamie had lived in this town his whole life, and sometimes I forgot how sheltered he was. Satellite navigation? My dad has a GPS that he totally wouldn't notice missing for a day. Come on, Jamie. It'd be so much fun. I better get back. Jamie looked at his watch and then mounted his bike. My dad is taking me to a movie tonight. We rode in an uncomfortable silence until an idea struck me as we rolled over the abandoned train tracks. They were old and almost buried by plant growth. Hey, I know you don't want to talk about it, but has anyone ever found anything? No, well, my friend's older brother said he found some human bones out there once, but nobody believed him. Oh, and where do people look? Well, almost everybody goes to the lake. He pointed to the left of us, where we'd seen the teenagers heading earlier. It's pretty deep back there, but they figure that if there was another town, they would have lived by the lake, so that's where they go. Well, you know what I would do? I would follow the train tracks. I mean, they look pretty old, and I don't know why they would lay them going back into those woods, unless there was something back there. So that's where I'd go. Jamie considered this, and then nodded. Yeah, I guess I could buy that. No one follows the tracks that way, though. That's where that kid that disappeared went. I wasn't swayed. I didn't bring up the lost town again until 2 weeks later. It was the weekend before we were moving home, and my parents had a barbecue for the employees of Dad's new store and some of our neighbors. Jamie and I hung out inside the house and played my N64 while we flirted pretty outrageously. There had been an unspoken sort of mutual attraction throughout the summer that no one had had the guts to act on. Since I was moving home in 5 days, there really was nothing left to lose. Although his intentions were probably pure and genuine, I am embarrassed to say that mine were not. I thought that if I could make him want to impress me, he would agree to go looking for the lost town. The legend had thoroughly consumed me. I had been to the local library every morning for the past week looking for more information on the town and had found nothing. But legends don't just come from nowhere. I was sure of it. I knew if we didn't leave by 2 p.m., we wouldn't have enough daylight to carry out my plan. I already had a backpack packed with water, a flashlight, a camera, and a can of red spray paint. I figured if we left the tracks, we would need a way to find our way back to them. I thought I was so clever. Nothing in that backpack made a damn bit of difference in the end. I was a fool. I set my controller down and turned to look at Jamie. So, do you want to go out to the woods one last time? I raised my eyebrow at him and smiled. Yeah, he said excitedly, and he jumped up off the couch. Then, embarrassed, he cast his eyes down at the floor. Yeah, you know, if you want to, that's cool. Cool, let's go. I grabbed his hand and ran out the front door, grabbing my strategically placed backpack on the way. Jamie didn't even notice it. He was walking faster than I was. When we had gotten a decent way into the trees, Jamie turned around and looked briefly at my face before casting his eyes to the ground. He rubbed the back of his neck. I've actually, wanted to kiss you all summer. I was stunned to silence, absolutely dumbfounded that Jamie had found the guts to say anything like this. I knew I needed to fill the awkward silence left in its wake, so I did the only thing I could think of. I leaned in and kissed him. It was the awkward first kiss of two 12-year-olds, but it made me feel warm and sent a flight of butterflies swirling into my stomach. So I actually really did like Jamie. How about that? I let him go, and his face was the same shade of red that I imagined mine was. He quickly changed the subject to how long he'd wanted to ask me out, but that he didn't think I liked him back. We walked for a while carrying on this conversation, him oblivious to his surroundings, me subtly leading the way. It took him stumbling over the tracks to break off his monologue and finally notice the backpack. He looked at me like I'd punched him in the face. You can't be serious. Jamie, I know, but look, this is the last time I'm going to see you in a really long time, and I want to remember today. We will only be out for 2 hours max. We'll be back before they even realize we're gone. Jamie stared at the tracks for a minute and seemed to be considering it all. I held my breath until he finally let out a deep sigh. Okay. Oh my God, Jamie, He held up his finger, cutting me off. But we follow the tracks the entire time, and we turn around after an hour. Okay. I was so excited that I hugged him. It would be the first and last time I ever did. As we walked, we talked about all sorts of mundane things, stopping only to make sure we were still on the tracks. It felt like we had only been walking for 45 minutes, but when Jamie checked his watch, it had been 3 hours. That's weird. It hasn't been 3 hours. It says it's 5 o'clock. He trailed off. I swear we left just after 2. It can't be 5, dude. Your watch is busted. I gave him a playful shove. Jamie raised his eyebrow at me and smiled. Even so, we should probably turn around. He wasn't wrong. The sun was setting. The shadows were long and looking around. I wondered if it really was 5 o'clock, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. As we had been walking, I'd noticed something taking shape off of our right, a large mass, maybe a quarter mile away. It was denser than the area around it and seemed to have clean, man-made lines. Jamie, look, he turned. Yeah, I was hoping you hadn't noticed it. It's a long way off, though. We would never find the tracks again. Yes, we would. Check it out. I triumphantly pulled the spray paint out of my backpack. It's for the trees. He took the can and shook it, then made an experimental X on a nearby tree. Okay, but I get to do the spraying. I didn't argue. The closer we got to the mast, the more it took shape. First, we could tell it was a building, then we could tell it was church. By the time we got the front door, we were looking at a very old and dilapidated chapel. Remembering my camera, I took a picture of the wooden plaque over the door. Whatever had been written on it had long ago worn away. We walked around the church in awe. The building was small, maybe 500 square feet. The windows were, surprisingly, all intact, but were so caked with dirt and grime that we couldn't see anything inside. How do we get in? I asked quietly. I don't know, but we're going to figure it out. Wait until my brother hears about this. I mean, holy shit, look at this place. His excitement was contagious. The front door had a pull handle, but try as we might, we couldn't seem to open the door. Do you think it's locked? I asked as I watched Jamie struggle with it. Yeah, maybe. I mean, it must be. There was a door around back, though. The door at the back was a lot more sympathetic and let us in with relative ease. We were standing in a small room with an old wooden desk attached to a wall. There was a small fireplace and old portraits hung up around the tiny office. The people in the pictures were all standing in front of the same maroon background and were looking down at us disapprovingly. Books were scattered everywhere, most in a language I had never seen before. The floor was covered in dirt and a pair of old shoes were laying haphazardly in one corner. Whoa, I said in awe. Yeah, whoa. I looked over at Jamie, who had a huge smile on his face. He was holding up a cross and a piece of paper. What is it? I walked over to see. It's a list of names. There's like 60 people on this list. Maybe a town census? Let me see. I pulled my flashlight out of my backpack and shined it on the parchment. Deepwood. Do you think that's the name of the town? All these names are crossed out, all except this one. I pointed to a name at the very bottom. Maybe it was the plague. You think it's a list of the dead? Jamie shrugged. Makes as much sense as anything else. I walked over to the desk and leaned against it. Why do you think they left? I mean, look, there's a jacket or something on that chair and shoes over there. The town pastor or whatever, he just took off and left everything like this. Or died, said Jamie as he folded the paper and put it into the backpack. Yeah, died. Either way, it must have been creepy as hell to be alone in here. I stared at one of portraits for several long seconds. The young woman painted there seemed to be staring down at me with a very accusatory look. It made me incredibly uncomfortable. I was so absorbed in the paintings that I didn't notice the slow creaking from overhead until the ceiling cracked loudly as it started to cave in. I screamed and covered my head, but the next thing I knew, I was lying on my back over the threshold of a door, Jamie on top of me protecting his head. Thanks, I mumbled as I gently pushed Jamie off of me. Don't mention it. Jamie climbed to his feet and brushed himself off. I glanced behind him at the office, which was now filled floor to ceiling with decaying debris. Jamie, that was our way out. That's okay. We can unlock the front door now that we're inside, or break one of the windows. If the back office was unsettlingly, the chapel was downright disturbing. Even though the grimy windows allowed very little sunlight in, I could make out 8 rows of pews lining a narrow aisle and a tall podium at the front of the chapel. Jamie and I stumbled around the small nave, breaking windows on either side with pieces of wood we had found. The sun was still setting, and I wondered how much of a difference the muted light would make. When I broke the last window on my side, I turned back around to survey the chapel, disappointed that the lighting wasn't much better. The room itself seemed to repel light. The wooden pews were completely rotted. In fact, the wood we had used to break the windows of the church were leg stands from the front row. The narrow aisle in between the rows of pews was littered with leaves and rotting wood. But that was nothing. Nothing compared to what sat upon the altar. It wasn't a podium, as I had thought earlier. It was a statue of the crucifixion, but unlike any I had ever seen before. The paint had been worn away on every part of the statue, except the blood of the crucifixion wounds, which stood bright and realistic, and seemed to be oozing before our very eyes. The only other surface left untouched by the decay of time was the face of Jesus. The details of his face were still so incredibly minute and perfect, and he had the same accusing eyes as the portraits in the pastor's office. He seemed to be staring directly at me, and I could tell Jamie felt the same, though he was across the room from me. The statue's stare awarded me with an edge of panic, and I suddenly realized that we needed to leave. We weren't wanted here. I had the sudden feeling that we were trespassing on some sort of hallowed ground. We had found the church. We had documents proving we had been here, and now it was time to go. I turned to Jamie to tell him so, and could immediately tell that he did not share my feelings. He had been born and bred on these legends, and nothing was going to tear him away from our discovery. I watched him walk over to grab the camera out of my bag. He took pictures of everything he deemed interesting, including the crucifixion statue, much to my unease. I gave him several minutes before I said something. "Jamie, I think we need to leave," I said in a low voice. Jamie stopped and looked up, seeming to remember I was there. "Are you kidding? This is what you came for. We have to bring home evidence of all of it." "It's going to be dark in half an hour. It's already hard to see in here." "Duh, that's why I'm using a flash. Hey, can you get a picture of me next to this creepy Jesus thing?" I guess," I mumbled as I took the camera from him. I didn't even want to look at it, much less photograph it, but if it would help me get him out of here, I was going to stomach it. Jamie wrapped his arm around it just as I snapped the picture. "Don't touch it." "Oh crap, why did you touch it?" "There's something off about that thing, Jamie. Can we frickin' go now?" "Yeah, fine." Jamie walked over and picked up the backpack as I headed toward the front door. I noticed there was no lock on it. I pushed against the door as hard as I could. It didn't budge. My heart sank. There wasn't even a handle or a knob. It was just a solid piece of wood with strange markings on it, symbols I had never seen before. "Jamie, the door is stuck," I said as I turned around to see him testing a piece of the floor with his foot. "What are you doing?" I asked, hearing the edge of panic in my voice. He was still at the front of the chapel, a foot from the Jesus statue, hopping back and forth from one part of the floor to another. The statue's eyes seemed to be only on him now. "There's something under here, see?" I heard the floorboard creak under his left foot as he put weight on it. "Jamie, don't." "No, it's like under the dirt right here, the floor is hollow." He kneeled down and started digging through the thin layer of dirt. "It's like a trap door or something." And it was indeed a trap door. By the time I had walked the length of the pews, Jamie already had the edges dug halfway out. "Let's just leave it, and your brother and his friends can come back and see what it is, please, Jamie. I want to go." There was something wrong with this place. Terribly wrong. And the thought of spending one more minute here had me on the precipice of an anxiety attack, something I hadn't experienced in over a year. I sat down against the front pew and put my head down. I heard a roaring in my ears and my breathing grew labored. I had to leave here, even without Jamie. I rocked back and forth for a few minutes as I tried to calm myself down. I would climb out a window and run. In any direction, it didn't matter. "There's something here under the church." Jamie's voice sounded a million miles away. By the time I pulled myself together enough to lift my head, Jamie was knelt next to me, stroking my hair. "I didn't know you were claustrophobic." "At least, that's what I think," Jamie said. I better remember the horror I felt as I stared at the hole in the floor. Jamie had opened the trap door. 2 minutes, Jamie said as he stood up. "We go down. We take a couple pictures of whatever's down there and we come right back up and leave. Just 2 minutes, Katie, that's all I'm asking." I wanted to say no. I intended to. But I felt myself slowly nodding as Jamie pulled me to my feet. To this day, I don't understand why I agreed. But I suppose that it's better that what happened down there didn't happen to Jamie alone. We're going to come back with the story of a lifetime. What if there is gold down there? Or like valuable paintings or gold or something? We would be rich. So rich that your family could stay here. You could buy the house you're living in and come to school with me in September. I managed a small smile. Of all the things someone could think to buy with wealth, Jamie's first thought was to keep me here with him. And he was right. There could be anything down there, and almost all old stuff was valuable. I took a deep breath. Okay, 2 minutes, I agreed. As we leaned over the trapdoor and peered down, the first thing we noticed was an intense heat emanating upwards from the hole. The second was the strangely out-of-place spiral staircase leading into the depths below. Jamie rolled the flashlight over to me with his foot, and I picked it up as he pulled his lighter out of his pocket. "Ladies first," he smirked at me. I stared at him slack-jawed. "No way. You found this door? You go first. Between the black staircase and the heat, I feel like we're descending directly into hell. I am not going first." I crossed my arms and glared at him to reinforce my point. Jamie simply shrugged and stepped onto the staircase. I took several deep breaths as I watched his head disappear into the darkness below. I almost didn't follow him. I was still deciding when he yelled at me to shine the flashlight down the stairs so he could see. I started down the stairs after him. They went down much farther than I thought, and it became warmer and warmer the further down we went. When we finally reached the bottom, I was holding back what threatened to be a massive anxiety attack. We were farther beneath the church than I thought we'd be, and it was hot, muggy, and difficult to breathe. Hoping to get this over with as fast as possible, I swung the flashlight around the chamber, hoping to reveal its hidden treasure. What I saw there, I can never describe, though I have tried many times. The room was entirely empty, save 2 things. One was a desk in the corner, much like the one in Pastor's office. The second was another statue. This one was roughly 12 feet tall and remains to this day the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. To put it mildly, it was some sort of demon. It towered over us, and as such I could only see the bottom of its jaw from where I was. It was looking directly ahead of it, at the staircase we had just descended. Its tail was long and swept around the entire room. There wasn't a lot of room to move. It had claws, like any modern depiction of a demon, and as I moved around the chamber to view its profile, I noticed it had horns as well. Neither Jamie nor I spoke as we shuffled around room, our backs to the wall as far away from the demon as physically possible. I stepped carefully over the tail as I made my way to its back and came around to the other side of the statue. I couldn't take my eyes from it. I couldn't trust it. If the statue upstairs seemed to bleed, what could this one do? As I eyed the talons on the gigantic stone feet, Jamie broke the silence. "Can you even believe this shit?" His voice was coming from the other side of the room. I searched the darkness for the weak glow of his lighter and was relieved to see it moving towards me. I turned my flashlight upward to shine it on the side of the demon's head. The horns had to be at least a foot tall. As I brought it down to see where Jamie was, I hit my arm on something hard. "Ow, my head!" Jamie squeaked as my flashlight fell to the ground and rolled under the desk. "God damn it, Jamie," I whispered in a panic. I dropped to my knees and felt around under the desk. "It's not my fault you cracked me on the head." I stood back up with the flashlight to see Jamie trying to relight his lighter. But it wasn't that stopped me dead. I will forever be frozen in that moment. I don't know why I couldn't speak, couldn't scream, couldn't move. All I could feel was my own intern descent into madness. As I had moved the beam of light up to Jamie's face, I had seen another face right next to his, the demon's. The statue was bent down and turned to the side, its head mere inches from Jamie's, and it was staring at me. I cannot describe its face, and I am not sure my mind will ever let me remember it in detail. It shook me to my core in a literal sense. My body was having a dark, violent, visceral reaction to this impossibility. Jamie finally noticed the flashlight shaking in my hand and turned to see what I was looking at. It wasn't until he started screaming that I was shaken from my paralysis. I dropped the flashlight. Jamie dropped everything else, and we ran. We took the stairs 2 and 3 at a time, Jamie pushing me up ahead of him, Halfway up, I slipped, and we both went tumbling down halfway to the bottom. In that horrible moment, we heard the grinding of stone against stone, and we knew the statue was moving. Jamie screamed, but I was mute, too horrified to make a sound. We got up and kept climbing, never taking our eyes off the small light above us, our only salvation now. We were almost to the top when we first heard it on the stairs. It was so large and heavy that the entire staircase shook with the impact, terrified that the stairs would come crashing down and we would be left alone with it below. We jumped the last 3 steps and Jamie pushed me up out of the trapdoor. He climbed out after me and tried to slam the trapdoor shut, but it was unmoving. We could hear a deafening thunder on the staircase as the demon slowly climbed the steps. I helped Jamie try to push the trapdoor closed, and for the first time noticed the symbols on the bottom of the wood, the same as those on the front door. Before I could begin to comprehend this, I noticed the statue first penetrate the shaft of light on the staircase below. It was coming. Jamie saw it too, and pulled me to a standing position while pointing at the front door. We both ran at it as hard as we could, but when we hit it, it didn't budge. We tried again, but it was unsympathetic to our crisis. "Katie, the windows!" We ran to the closest one and tried to climb up the wall to get out, but the windows were too high. The thunder from below was getting louder, closer. It was more than halfway up the stairs. We tried to climb on the rotting pews to reach the windows, but they crumbled under our weight. "I'll push you out. Give me your foot," Jamie yelled over the sound bellowing from below. I shook my head. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But I couldn't leave him. I couldn't leave Jamie to face that thing alone. We both looked over at the door again. Our only chance was to keep trying to break it down. We stumbled back into the aisle and ran at the front door with everything we had. I thought I felt it move. We backed up even further and ran at it again. This time the impact knocked me backwards into the aisle and Jamie barely stayed on his feet. He looked at me in horror, and I turned around the sea-stone horns rising up from the darkness of the trapdoor, 3 feet from where I sat. We were going to die here. I stood up, refusing to turn around again. I knew that the next step it took would bring its head into the room, and the thought of seeing its face again had me running at the door with every last bit of strength I had. Jamie reached it at the same time, and I felt it give way as we crashed through the threshold and landed outside the church. Jamie had picked me up off the ground before I could think to move, and we were running toward the train tracks at an Olympic sprint. We could still hear the thundering on the stairs no matter how far we got from the church. Every step echoed through the woods like a gunshot, until they stopped. It was in the church. I had no idea if we had run in the right direction, or if we would be forever lost in those woods. It was now dark outside, and the temperature was dropping fast. I was beginning to panic that we would never find the train tracks, when I noticed Jamie wasn't next to me anymore. I turned around in a panic to find him sprawled on the ground a few yards behind me. He had tripped over one of the rails. He was up and running down the tracks before I could even ask if he was okay. We ran until we couldn't anymore. Our running eventually slowed to a jog and the jog to a walk. We hadn't spoken. Neither of us had any idea what to say, and it wasn't until we had both gotten our breath back that one of us finally broke the silence. "How long have we been on the tracks?" Jamie's voice had an edge of barely suppressed fear. I looked at his wrist and noticed his watch was missing. It didn't take us this long to find that place. Or did it? "Do you think maybe we went the wrong way?" Jamie asked hesitantly. I couldn't afford to think like that. If we had somehow gotten turned around and ran the wrong way down the train tracks, then we were deeper into the woods than ever. "No, we went the right way," I said to convince myself. "That thing," Jamie started, "I thought it was a statue, but maybe it was some crazy undiscovered giant reptile that was like hibernating and we woke it up. So we were going to delude ourselves into thinking that there was a scientific explanation for this. I understood why, but I just couldn't accept it." "Yeah," I said slowly. Did you see the weird writing on the front door? It was on the trapdoor too. Do you think it was keeping it down there?" Because, Jamie, all those doors are open now. Well, if it's an animal, words mean nothing to it anyway. Yeah, if... I trailed off, hoping he would challenge my implication. He didn't. I could tell this was something Jamie's mind wouldn't accept. But he hadn't seen its face. Not like I had. It was no animal. It was made of stone. It was something sinister and anciently evil. And it had seen me. Had seen right down into my soul. It was aware of me, and I was aware of it. And now it was free. Whatever had been keeping it beneath the church has been awkwardly destroyed by Jamie and me. That thing was free to walk the woods and go God knows where. We walked in silence for another half hour, until Jamie suddenly stopped short and started yelling. Here! We're here! He booked it down the tracks toward a swarm of flashlights, and I followed close behind him. As soon as Jamie reached his parents, he collapsed, while I ran into my mother's arms and cried like a child. I couldn't hold it together any longer. The police report says we were found at 4 a.m. by our sense of time, about 3 hours after the sun had set. We had spent less than an hour in the chapel, and yet we seemed to have lost 10 hours there. We never told anyone where we had actually been, or that we had found the lost city of Deepwood. We simply said we went for a walk to the lake and got lost in the woods. My family left Middlesbrough the following Monday, 2 days ahead of schedule. My father had another store to open, and there was really no reason to wait. Jamie didn't come to say goodbye to me, and after we left Middlesbrough, I never saw him again. I kept a copy of the police report to remember him. Over the following year, Middlesbrough slowly disappeared. At first, I could just feel the memory fading unnaturally from my mind. My parents couldn't remember that we had ever been there, which scared me more than anything else. I taped the police report to the ceiling over my bed so that Jamie would be the first and last thing I thought about every day. Next, the Middlesbrough city website disappeared, as did that of the local paper and the town's 2 public schools. The store my dad helped open in 2002 also disappeared from the company's website. After that, I could never find any mention of Middlesbrough anywhere online ever again. Over the years, I searched public records for Jamie's full name and found nothing. I hired someone to illegally search private records, and he came up empty too. In the end, the only proof that Jamie ever existed at all was the police report with his name on it, and then nothing was left. One day the paper I had had taped to my ceiling for so many years was blank. I remember what it was and what it looked like before, but now it's just an old weathered piece of blank paper. All that remains of Middlesbrough and the people who lived there are my memories, and this is why I am writing this story down and uploading it to the internet. Once it's on the internet, it can never die, right? Or perhaps one day it will just disappear, and you won't remember ever seeing it, and I won't remember ever writing it. And I can only hope that this ended with Middlesbrough. If it has moved on to other towns, who would know? Who would even remember? I wish I had answers, but all I have are questions. My name is James Lockley, and I have been a backpacking guide around the world for most of my life. From the frozen wastes of the Russian tundra to the tropical dense jungles of the Amazon, and damn near everything in between. Always putting my clients' needs above my own, even at the cost of my food and water in some instances. Like this one time, I gave up nearly a day's worth of food since my client at the time had forgotten where he stashed food for the return journey from K2. Even gave up my favorite meal to eat, spaghetti and meatball MRE. But I am not writing this story to talk about my selflessness by giving up food. Nor am I going to talk about the close calls I had getting clients out of trouble on numerous occasions. No, this story is one that changed me into the person I am today, but let me back up a bit first. I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 weeks ago, stage 4. It was unexpected to say the least. Wrestling with my mortality is something I am still working towards as life slowly dwindles from my body. The doctors tell me I could last about 6 months max with treatment. but I elected to opt out of that. I have been here long enough, and have done enough to last almost 3 lifetimes. Plus, I want to go out on my own terms. My 55 years on this earth were filled with so many life-fulfilling experiences that they are all almost hard to remember, but one has always been in the back of my mind, haunting my dreams and my waking life like an ever-looming ghost, looking to torment me slowly to the grave. I want to share this story before I become too weak to record it down for the world to remember, a story of my greatest disgrace, an attempt to reconcile for what I have done and let the story of the people I failed to be known. For the safety of young and dumb adventurers, I am omitting my specific location at the time and where I went, but not the names of those involved. Without further ado, I guess. This all started roughly 30 years ago. I was a young buck waiting tables in an attempt to save money to be able to move to South America and start my career guiding people on backpacking trips and expeditions throughout the region and eventually the world. I put everything I had working towards this goal and was going to achieve it no matter what, spending all my time outside of work saving money however I could. I ate so much ramen noodles. I was still some ways off from affording the move, so I started advertising myself as a wilderness guide in my area. Willing to go anywhere in the Rocky Mountain states for damn near any amount of money. At the time, I was an avid hiker and backpacker, spending all my weekends exploring the local trails, forests, and whatever landscape I could to get more experience. That's why I was off the walls excited when I was approached by this brother and sister team who wanted me to guide them through an unknown section of the mountains nearby that had come to their attention. They had learned about me through one of my friends who attended the local university. I asked everyone I knew to help me advertise myself as a hiking and backpacking guide, and it finally paid off with those posters that I politely forced them to hang up for me. They first introduced themselves as Adam and Bethany Dalarosa, 2 wide-eyed, nerdy nature enthusiasts and college students. Adam was tall and a little lanky, sporting an unkempt mustache with trimmed black hair that suited him well. Bethany wore circular-framed glasses and kept her brown hair in a ponytail, and had beautiful green eyes, and was short compared to her tall brother. Probably a foot of height difference between them. We exchanged pleasantries for a bit before they started telling me that they learned of a potentially unused or forgotten region of the mountains that they were interested in exploring for one of their college classes. Something along the lines of a field project they had to complete before they were allowed to graduate. I can't remember the details of it. Even though they explained it to me multiple times, all I cared about was getting the experience in with clients. Hearing about this from a friend of a friend sort of deal whose names all escape me at the moment. Elaborating that this would likely be about a week, maybe less. Long trip deep into the mountains and forested valley that I was decently familiar with. I had done a few longer trips around a week long, so I had a rough idea of how to prepare for such an adventure. But Adam and Bethany had only been hiking on trails and marked paths in their time, so they wanted someone with more experience on longer trips and with unfamiliar territory. They scraped together a rather generous amount of money up front for me to secure my time and interest in. But I was already interested in this before a down payment of sorts was even mentioned. This was just a bonus. It got me that much closer to my goal after all. Looking back, I should have turned them down or at least advised to shorten the trip length because they weren't ready for such a trip, and neither was I. Nobody could have been ready for what we experienced. The planning for the trip took a couple of weeks, gathering the necessary supplies needed to last about a week in the wilderness. Food, water, camping supplies, things to make fire, and protect ourselves in case of wildlife that got too close. Things of that nature. Fast forward a few weeks to the day of the trip, I took some time off from waiting tables since the money they scraped together was enough for me to take time off and not lose much money. I needed the break from the job anyway. We carpooled to a local trailhead and were surprised to see it had been closed for a couple of days since before we arrived, so we had to park up the dirt road and walk from there. The sign posted by the park rangers said this trailhead was in process of being shut down since it is sparingly used, and trail conditions have been deteriorating for a while, like that was going to stop us. They told me precious little about this offbeat route that hardly anyone knew about, I don't ever recall seeing or hearing of such a thing despite my own visits to this place, saying their friend of a friend told them it was somewhere between mile 4 and 7 near some trees off trail, very descriptive when hiking in a forested region such as this. Keeping our eyes peeled, we hiked for about 5 miles on this relatively easy way that looped around one mountain only to dip into the valley and then back up another. Along the way, we chit-chatted, getting to know each other a little better. They told me about how they both moved away from abusive parents a few towns over, leaving when Bethany turned 18, since Adam was older by about a year, and wasn't going to abandon his sister at a house where the abuse would only escalate in his absence. They both decided to go to the same college, being the first in their family to accomplish such a feat. I gave them a small congratulations on being able to escape an abusive household and try to make something of themselves. The conversation quickly shifted after that, though. I remember Bethany going on and on about her love for drawing and painting, while Adam just smiled and nodded as she kept talking. He seemed to be the stoic, quiet type, I remember thinking, only talking when he had something to add. That conversation drew to a close after Bethany finished talking about whether she liked painting or drawing more. It ended up being a tie. They began chatting amongst themselves a few feet ahead of me as I was taking a look at a map I brought to get an idea of where this path could be and where it could lead us. Not really paying attention to her footing amidst the conversation, Bethany tripped over a medium-sized rock lodged in the ground. Falling hard and fast forward, she got a sizable cut vertically across her right shin over a sharp rock leading uphill. Adam pulled out a small first aid kit to patch his sister up before I could even ask Bethany if she was all right, always ready to help his sister. While he was cleaning the wound and applying a bandage, I put my map away for a moment and wandered a bit towards a large, fallen dead tree about 50 meters away, looking to break off a branch to whittle down and transform into my personal hiking stick. I lumbered over the tree and was scanning for a decent branch to use. And that is when I noticed this tiny dirt groove in the middle of a grove of trees, another 25 meters beyond the fallen tree. I walked over to it and glanced down the inlet expanding further into the forested valley downhill. I walked back to Adam and Bethany, who had just finished dressing and treating her wound. They both shot up with excitement and wonder in their eyes when I told them I believed to have found the path they mentioned. You couldn't see it from the main hike, so I could understand why next to nobody knew about this trail. We hurriedly walked over to the passage that curiously seemed to start out of nowhere in the middle of these trees, and began our true journey on a path less traveled. Excitement filling the air between Adam and Bethany as we strode towards our unknown destination. But once starting, I couldn't help but feel this sense of anxiety doom as I led these two down a path I never heard of or seen before. At the time, I attributed it to the nerves of my first time guiding people, but I was oh so wrong. The map was of little use to me anymore since I couldn't seem to find this boulevard of dirt anywhere on it, despite knowing our general location before departing on this offshoot. I only had a vague idea of where we were, and at the time I thought that was enough. It looked as if nobody had set foot on it in years, barely noticeable while twisting and turning deeper into the forest and further into the valley of the mountains surrounding us. Nature had all but reclaimed this dirt way, as if in an attempt to hide a forgotten secret from the world. The beginning part of this trek was challenging. We wandered off this half-hidden, half-visible route more than once, since it blended in with the surrounding grass and dirt beneath our feet. We couldn't have gone more than a few miles before I decided we needed to make camp for the night, as the sun was setting and we all deserved a break from this maze-like forestry. I took out my knife and marked a couple of trees right next to the trail, so we would be able to find it the next day as we went a little off the path, until we found a small clearing that was a good spot to rest for the night. Adam and Bethany began setting up their tents as I searched for firewood to get a nice fire going. I returned with arms full of firewood with the sun half set still and set up my tent as well. There was only a sliver of the sun over the horizon by the time I got my tent set up and the fire going for us all. We enjoyed some dried ration meals and conversations around the warmth of the fire as the sun was fully set by this point. We talked about what we liked to do in our spare time when they weren't in school and I wasn't busy hating my job waiting tables. Adam shared he liked casually playing soccer as a goalkeeper, even though due to his tall frame I would have pegged him as a basketball player. He said he hated basketball and got that all the time. Along with soccer, Adam told me how he also enjoyed reading in his spare time, one of his favorite books being The Exorcist, the same one that later came out as a movie. Bethany talked our ears off about her hobbies of swimming, even bragging how she can swim better than her brother, as well as continuing her talk about drawing and painting from earlier that day as well, which we both happily listened to. It felt nice to talk with people again. I felt for the first time in a while I had made some actual friends, and it filled me with a warmth that a fire couldn't quite do. As the conversation continued, the crackling of wood filled the cool night air as they told me about how they wanted to be some kind of biologist and study nature in its entirety, since they both loved being outside and interacting with life of all kinds when they could. I shared my dream to become a professional guide across the entire world if I could, also taking the opportunity to thank them for giving me this opportunity of being a real guide for someone. Our conversations continued as we laughed and joked around the fire for longer than I had anticipated, until it was time that we all retreated to our respective tents for the night. Sleep came easy that night, as the cacophony of nature singing around me hushed me into a dreamless sleep like a lullaby. The following morning, I woke up before Adam and Bethany and began packing away my tent and putting out the fire. I let them sleep a little longer since they had earned it. We exchanged morning pleasantries with one another when they emerged from their tents about 20 minutes later. I waited for them to finish packing up their things while I ate a breakfast bar for some morning energy. I tossed them each one from my pack when they finished and told them to eat up while we continued onward. We all walked confidently back on the path to find the knife marks I left the night before. Finding them in no time at all, the day had officially begun. However, that day was especially difficult as the forest condensed around us the further we ventured forth. It was a rough journey, to say the least. Tree limbs and dense foliage encompassed the entire lane forward, and our progress was slowing close to a crawl as we manipulated our way down the barely visible footpath. We made less progress than I originally thought we would, probably venturing no further than 2 or 3 miles. It seemed almost as if the forested valley itself was trying to stop us from venturing deeper and discovering a terrible secret. The whole day was filled with challenging backpacking and maneuvering through an unforgiving, dwindling forest path, with little conversation between us besides the occasional checking in on everyone and breaks for water and food. It was an exhausting chug through the valley. We happened upon a small opening to the left of the artery of foliage and decided to make camp for the night as the sun was beginning to set. Marking up some trees, as I did the night before, as to not lose our place in the forest. As I gathered firewood just like before, Adam and Bethany set up my tent for me while I was out in a nice gesture of friendship. I returned to camp delighted to see I didn't have to do so myself and thanked them for their kind effort, exchanging smiles with them both. The conversation wasn't as lively that night, though. We all had mirrored expressions of exhaustion that spoke more than our words could at that time. We ate our food rather quickly, not even waiting for a blooming blaze to warm it that night, retreating to our tents as hastily as we could to find adequate amounts of sleep for another exhausting day of backpacking at dawn. Sleep would not find us that night, however, since that was when our waking nightmare would begin. At first, the forest was quiet, besides the symphony of crickets and frogs singing out in the night as I laid my head down. Trying my best to listen in and have it lull me to sleep, that is when I noticed it just before sleep had encompassed me. A sound that was barely discernible from the chorus of the forest around me. But the more I focused on it, the more disturbed I became by the noise I heard. It sounded like a low crying moan of a dying animal. It continued to crescendo in volume until the rest of the forest began to tune out, as my mind honed in on that sound that seemed to be encompassing every corner of my mind the more I listened. I also wasn't the only one who noticed it as well. I heard the tents rustling open as we all emerged from our tents to see if anyone had any idea what that noise was that we were hearing. We exchanged glances of curious fear as we attempted to make sense of what we were hearing. It didn't sound like any animal we had heard before, and as we stood around the entrances of our tents, we knew we had to see what it was making that noise, for sleep was not going to find us as long as we heard this creeping noise. There was no way we could ignore it, or even worse, listen to this low-pitched siren-like moan all through the night. So we gathered a couple of flashlights that we packed, and threw a couple more pieces of firewood on the campfire so we could still see it in the distance as we ventured forth. Adam brandished a sizable knife that he had been carrying to ready himself for whatever lay forward, as I also did the same. The sound seemed to be coming in the direction further down the trail we had been hiking on previously, so we walked down it, cautiously, and ever so slowly. We were all practically piled on each other, with Adam slightly ahead of me and to my far left, while Bethany was in the middle of us wielding one of the flashlights, and myself wielding the other, dashing our flashlights back and forth in the pitch blackness in a desperate attempt to illuminate whatever could be making this horrific sound. The pathway wasn't nearly as bad as it was during the daytime. Branches, vines, and bushes seemed to part from where we stepped, as if it wanted no part of what was about to happen. The wailing moan was getting louder, and with increasing intensity, the more we inched forward. It sounded as if an animal was being tortured with relentless cruelty, and was crying out uncontrollably for a savior to come to release it from the pain, or yet praying for the release of death. Each step forward was sending our hearts further into an ascending frenzy as the sound got louder and louder in our ears. My heart was practically beating in my throat. The sound was at the point of complete uproar, inches from our ears, and that's when the path ended and opened up to a grove-like clearing with a near-perfectly circular pond resting in the middle. This pond couldn't have been 500 meters from our campsite, and it seemed to be the end of the trail as it completely dissipated upon discovering this hidden grove at the heart of the valley. The moon was full and shining upon the pond with a circular clearing overhead, and causing the still pond to glisten with beauty in the moonlight, with a smooth reflection of the moon across its surface. Despite the beauty of the moonlight, we all looked at each other and knew what each was thinking at that moment. The moaning had completely stopped, and we didn't know why. That was only the first thing we all noticed. The second was that despite not hearing the moan anymore, we couldn't hear anything anymore. There were no sounds of frogs, crickets, bugs, or wildlife at all. It was as silent as a graveyard, and that made us all more anxious than we thought possible. My heart pounding is the only thing I could hear in my ears at that point, and I wanted to leave immediately. But before the suggestion could leave my mouth, that's when Bethany began to tap both mine and Adam's arms like an excited child who can't wait to point something out to their parents. She pointed across the water, and that's when we all became starstruck at the same time. A flower unlike any of us had seen before. A flower that looked as if a star had fallen from the heavens and implanted itself on the edge of the pond to bless it with its presence. It was magnificent and captivated us all the moment we laid eyes upon it. We all walked towards it in near unison. Admiration and curiosity flooded my mind, almost as if I had no control over my own body and needed to see this flower up close and personal. The flower itself looked like a silver-white lily with a thick stem and expansive petals that seemed like it was radiating pure starlight. It seemed to have a glow about it, with the stigma of the flower protruding proudly from its center, and the stamen of the flower almost representing small stars themselves. To say that it was captivating was, to put it mildly, it was almost hypnotizing. Bethany was leading us with Adam a few feet behind her and myself a few feet behind him. She was the first to get close to the flower and reached out to touch it, slowly inching her hand towards the petals until she was just mere inches from it, and that's when it happened. A black, sludge-like slug the size of a small car emerged from the pond with eyes, God the eyes, dozens of eyes and faces of animals lining its slimy, grotesque, malformed, matte-back skin. Each eye was different from the rest in size and shape, ranging from near human-like to the soulless-looking doll eyes and everything in between. It made my own eyes dart all over its body, trying to reconcile and make sense of what I was looking at. The faces lining its body appeared to be almost jutting out from the inside of its body, crying out in pain and desperation, hoping that someone or anyone would come to be their savior from what seemed to be a never-ending torment. Animal and human faces screaming at us for help burned a forceful memory into my brain. It was all anyone could hear from the moment it emerged, and it could pierce the most stalwart of hearts with how soul-wrenching it was. It's a sound nobody could forget. Time seemed to slow down tremendously as I watched this abomination of life lash out with its black sludge tendrils at Bethany, grabbing her by her injured right shin. She kicked at the creature's body with her other foot, but was met with her boot sticking to its frame and sucking in her other leg like a frantic man in quicksand. She attempted to grasp at the surrounding grass and shrubbery in a vain attempt to claw her way out of that thing's grasp. Being reeled in like a freshly hooked bass on a summer morning, all Bethany could do at this point was scream and cry out in pure terror, pleading and reaching for us to save her from a certain grisly fate that awaited her. From the moment I saw this monstrosity emerge from its hiding place in the pond, I was paralyzed with fear and dread, a crushing feeling in my chest, preventing me from moving a single muscle fiber in my body in an attempt to help her. At first, he recoiled a few steps backward in fearful instinct when the creature emerged from its hiding place, near dazed by trying to make sense of it all. When Bethany started screaming for help is when he snapped out of it and overcame his fear of the beast in an attempt to save his sister, gunning towards the tendrils that grasped his sister with his knife wielded in his right hand. The flower on the end of its body began to quiver and tremble as Adam got closer to it, violently shaking back and forth until he was a few feet away from the knife connecting with that abomination's tendrils. That's when the dust spewed forth from the center of the flower in a wide arc around him. Purplish-pink dust filled the air around him and was so thick that I could barely see his figure once he was encompassed in it. The dust reminded me of fresh pollen falling from a large pine tree in springtime, with how much spewed forth and how thick it was. How could such a beautiful flower be attached to such a monstrosity of life, baiting animals with its beauty only for it to be wielded by a horrid creature? I glanced over to Bethany, her gaze meeting mine, her green eyes pleading and begging for me to do anything to save her. But I couldn't. Still paralyzed by pure fear, I could only watch as she helplessly flailed like fish out of the water as that thing continued to reel her in. Adam began coughing violently and swinging his knife around with pure randomness. Mere seconds passed by, and I watched him fall back hard like a cold knockout from a boxer. My legs still not allowing me to move, the dust crept towards me with the wind that picked up and dissipated it. But not before I inhaled some, not thinking to hold my breath. Bethany's screams for help mixing with the unceasing moans crying out was the last thing I heard in the sober world before the only thing I could hear anymore was the unyielding moaning pains of creatures trapped in that thing's body for eternity. I felt my eyes begin to become heavy and a sinking feeling in the back of my throat like there was something there that I just couldn't get rid of. My body felt light and heavy at the same time as a miasma of shapes and colors began to cloud and distort my vision slowly. The price to pay for interfering with its meal. I had taken shrooms a few times and LSD once before this, so I had a pretty decent idea of what psychedelics were and what to expect when tripping, but this was on a whole different level. I looked over in a dazed horror at Adam as the moonlight was shining over him. I could barely see that his eyes were completely black and staring through me, looking as if devoid of life altogether. He was glaring at me with those pitch-black eyes, and he didn't need to speak a word for me to know what he wanted to say if he could talk. "Help us, please." The creature was wasting no time as I struggled to get a grip on reality and the situation at hand with these psychedelics ramping up in intensity as the seconds ticked by. It was reeling in Adam as he stared into me with those dull black eyes, looking through me as that thing's tendrils were wrapped around his ankles and dragging him across the ground to a horrid fate that awaited him. The last I saw of Bethany was a hand reaching out of the side of the creature's body, quivering and twitching with the last seconds of life as she was absorbed into the creature's body. I was getting lightheaded and I knew if I didn't start moving soon, then I would become its third meal for the night. I focused all of my efforts on forcing my frozen legs to move before I was grabbed by its sludge-ridden tendrils. Finally, I was able to move my terror-stricken body, fear for my own life being the only driving force. I dropped my knife and ran like a coward. I ran as hard and as fast as I could back the way we came as the forest began to contort around me, swirling and transforming into indescribable shapes and colors as if I was being sucked into a black hole of living, colorful energy. The incessant moaning of those trapped inside that abomination screeched in my head like a siren's wail as I retreated away from that thing. The void of living energy encompassed me as I sprinted for God knows how long in a sea of transforming and shape-shifting unknowable patterns of near-blinding radiant colors that I couldn't fully comprehend. All the while, those cries for help tore at my brain with ramping intensity. As the maelstrom of hallucinations enveloped my sense of sight completely, and the howling moans of the damned inside my head were raging, I collapsed mid-stride and my world went black. I awoke in a hospital in a panic, heart rate racing through the roof, and with the slight swirling of color and shapes still in my vision. Nurses rushed in to calm me down, but it took restraining and some drug injected into the IV to descend me back down to a calm state. Returning from my manic state, they told me I was found by park rangers in the early hours of the morning, passed out in the middle of the trail about 4 or 5 miles in, and completely unresponsive to anything they did to try and bring me to. They drew some blood while I was incapacitated and told me that numerous psychedelic compounds were found in my blood, some that were unknown to doctors there. They had a plethora of questions, but I skewed the truth out of pure fear and shame, thinking I was complacent in the deaths of Adam and Bethany. I didn't even mention them as to not get the police involved. I told the doctors that I took some drugs that a friend gave me and went for a walk in the woods and freaked out at some funky-looking trees and animals. I could tell they took that statement with more than a pinch of salt and treated me until the drugs were out of my system. I stayed overnight at the hospital, making sure my blood pressure and heart rate returned to normal before I was discharged the following day. Sleep didn't find me that night, however. I laid there all through the night thinking of what I had done, how cowardly my actions were. After leaving the hospital, I sold everything I couldn't carry with me in a suitcase and a backpack and moved to South America. It felt like running away from it, but I rationalized it as a way to do better somewhere else, if that makes any sense. It's not sometimes that I think about them, not a single day goes by that I don't think about them and that crude parody of life that took their lives from them and how I just stood there and watched. Could I have saved them? Maybe if I was less of a coward and acted faster, they would still be here on this earth. It retches and tears at my soul every day. Not only can I still hear the gurgling moan of eternally trapped creatures, but Adam and Bethany begging for my continuous help. I find no solace in the waking world or my dreams as I can hear it no matter where my mind drifts. All that's left to do now is put one in the chamber and pray that in the next life I can find peace and forgiveness.